T. Marie was kind enough to give us some time when our group was in Alabama last month for our Bearing Witness retreat to racism in America. And while we were in Birmingham, T. Marie came to um, the opening session meeting, if you will, of the retreat group in Birmingham, and spoke eloquently and in depth and in great detail about local history, uh, and it was enlightening for everybody who heard. And so we're so happy that you're joining us once again. Um, I won't go into T. Marie's whole bio and CV. It's extensive. It makes me envious. T. Marie has great and deep education, credentials, experience with various organizations. She's a speaker, an educator, a scholar, I think I can say, an activist, and is involved around the country in numerous activities around racial justice and equity, um, and involved in nonprofits and technology and a number of other things. So I encourage you to go afterwards to her website, tmarieking.com, 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 for more information. So with that, I'm going to hand the virtual microphone, T. Marie, over to you, and let you share as you will. And thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for having me. Yeah, I've had a very non-traditional path to today, but it has definitely been enjoyable, and I think reflective of kind of the work I found myself into. I love meeting different folks and just being able to connect with people. So I love having different entry points in my journey that makes it so much easier to connect with folks. So today I decided I wanted to share kind of the presentation, like what I normally do with groups. Back in, oh my gosh, maybe 2012, 2013, I attended a workshop in Montgomery, Alabama. And it was around kind of how do we move the needle forward when it comes to kind of racial justice and equity. And a friend of mine and myself, we drove in and we were like, yeah, we really want to be more in depth in this work. Let's see what this is about, how we can connect. And the first half of the day went great. You know, everybody was on their best behavior. And, you know, around after lunch, we had some more in-depth conversations. They showed us Slavery by Another Name, which is a very impactful film. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. And they had somebody come up and moderate some discussions, and we watched that person completely lose the room. People lost it, people got in their feelings, and my friend and I were kind of sitting off to the side like, whoa, I don't think that was supposed to happen. And so driving back to Birmingham, the thought that stuck with me was there has to be an easier way to have this conversation that's productive, that can move us towards change. And so for me, my whole focus became, how do I create space? How do I hold space so that we can have these hard conversations in a way that leads us towards change? And so I kind of crafted kind of my own um, framework of how we do that. You know, so I created a talk that's called Your World is Not the World, because I think a lot of the times we have our own experiences, we go through life, and then we start intersecting with our neighbors, with community members, and we think, oh, well, that experience is universal. Or I grew up like that. These other folks probably grew up like that as well. And it's like, that's not true. You know, we have our experience and it's uniquely ours. You know, and so helping people understand that we come in with our own stuff, with our own experiences that is different from our neighbors. You know, you can have two children that grow up in the same house and have two totally different experiences in the house, you know, so making sure that we understand, you know, that our world is not the world. The four principles that I kind of ground my work in that I do is first, braving discomfort. And I always say braving discomfort because I'm sure you have heard people say, or may have said it, and I'm not going to take your lunch money for saying this, but, you know, this is a safe space, you know, and the fact of the matter is, yeah, until somebody doesn't feel safe anymore. And a lot of times we don't know when that atmosphere has changed for people. You know, something is said or a comment is made or a look or something, and somebody may no longer feel safe. And so I ask people, brave the discomfort with me. Like, you're going to be uncomfortable. You're probably going to hear something you haven't heard before. You're going to, you know, somebody's going to say something you don't like, you know, but let's brave that discomfort. Let's push through this process together. Um, Next is self-reflection. I don't think we can move the needle on what's going on in our society if we're not doing that introspective work. If we're not taking that time to be self-reflective of not only how we show up in community, but how we operate and interact in community. You know, are we making sure that we're addressing our own biases? You know, are we creating less harm in communities that we're working with? You know, are we, you know, understanding the communities we're trying to work with? You know, I work with organizations all the time that say, well, we want to do this in this community, T. Marie. And it's like, that sounds great. Is that what they need? Is that what they want? Did they even send for you? You know, so making sure that we do that self-reflective work on ourselves. Another thing that I think is so important is deep listening. I think taking the time to truly listen to our neighbors, other communities, those who we may be serving, to make sure not only are we showing up correctly, but we're providing or supporting something that the community truly needs. And with that deep listening, that comes empathy and trust as well. And then lastly, my last principle is proximity and action. You know, I think is important, and I'm sure, you know, you may have heard this when you all went to Montgomery, but you know, Brian Stevenson, even in his work, talks about getting proximate to communities that have been marginalized and oppressed. And I think that's very vital and important. I think it's also not to just stop with getting proximate. You know, what is the action? You know, what is the call to action? You know, what is needed here? And so those are the things that I ground my work in. Again, braving discomfort, self-reflection, deep listening, proximity, and action. I think when we start thinking about, when you go back to braving discomfort, I think sometimes we don't want to have the hard conversations about how we got here, you know, and being able to be honest about these man-made disparities, as I call them, that happen in our community, has happened across time. You know, I think understanding an issue in a community is just as important as understanding what led us to it. You know, not blaming communities who are being marginalized or oppressed for the condition they're in, but what led to this. We were recently dealing with this here in Birmingham, where one of our large organizations was, you know, saying these issues are in our community. You know, these folks in this community are not purchasing houses, or, you know, they have high levels of diabetes or cholesterol. And I was like, but okay, that may be true, but are we going to talk about the redlining that led to the lack of home buyers? Are we going to talk about predatory lending that impacts these communities? Are we going to talk about, you know, the lack of healthy food access? You know, and in Alabama, in Birmingham, you know, we had, you know, steel mills, iron mills, you know, all of that pollution that went into our atmosphere, in our air, but also in our water system and in our land. Those things from years ago still impact these community members now. So even if somebody wants to grow healthy food, if they're using that polluted soil, they're growing polluted food. You know, so understanding, how do we get here? And I think that's so important. I think it's also very important to understand how you handle uncomfortable information. You know, how do you show up in conflict? You know, what's your zone is what I would call it. Are you somebody that want to stay in your comfort zone? It's like, this is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I'm familiar with. You kind of operate risk-free. It's safe. You're on cruise control. Are you somebody that is a panic person? You get overwhelmed. The information may be too much. You may get paralyzed by what's being shared. Or do you lean into the growth zone? And if that's not your normal reaction, that's somewhere where I would encourage you to get to lean into the growth zone, to be able to learn a new skill, learn something new, to stretch, to be uncomfortable. And it's okay to be uncomfortable. We all went through growing pains going from childhood into adulthood. And it's not fun. It's uncomfortable. We all went through the weird phase, around middle school or whatever. And it's like, but once you get through it, once you pass through that, okay, now I'm in a better space. So understanding there's history that got us here, understanding these disparities are man-made, knowing how do you respond when you get that new information, not staying in your comfort zone, not panicking, but taking the time to really lean into that growth zone. And then understanding that conflict is normal. We're going to always have conflict. We're going to deal with it, whether it's that normal conflict, somebody ate all your Lucky Charms and they didn't replace the box, your coworker keeps taking your stapler off your desk, normal conflict. If not dealt with, it will grow, and then you have that pervasive conflict that we deal with sometimes. And that's when an issue is not being dealt with and it continues to boil and eventually it grows if not dealt with. And then there's that overt conflict, which you never want to see us get to, but unfortunately we've seen it in society, definitely recently, where the intent is to harm. And so making sure that when we see conflict, whether it's brewing in our communities, whether it's brewing in our own individual relationships or society as well, that we're doing the work to make sure we're addressing those issues so that it doesn't grow and become a bigger thing. And so I think a lot of times in society, we tend to look at the moment that conflicts erupts into violence to try to understand what happens, when all along we should look at the history and the accumulations of harm and unresolved conflicts that led us there. And the thing that takes the work is when we've seen that eruption is now we got to go back and deal with those issues that led to it. We got to give people the space to not only reflect, but to deal with the hurt that has harmed them. I was working with a group in Selma, and we were addressing some of the issues that took place in Selma post the 60s. And they were still impacted by the military pulling out of Selma in the 70s because it took away the jobs. So now you have people in Selma still today that work in Birmingham, that work in Montgomery, that drive to Wetumpka in order for work. Now, the problem with that is people say, well, we're not seeing the money come back into the community. Well, yeah, because the taxes are going to those places that they actually work in. And so as we started diving deep into what's the reason why we're not seeing some of the progression you would all like to see in your community, that's when we started getting to some of those harms and those conflicts that happen that may have been state level issues, city level decisions that impacted them. But we were able to say, okay, no, this is where the harm took place. This is what we got to address. And we have folks that were like, yes, let's dig in. And then you have people that was like, I'm not ready to have that conversation yet. I didn't realize I was still upset or as angry, so I'm not ready for that. But being able to track and identify what did the harm take place, I think is very, to me, reminiscent of even the journey you all took of let's go bear witness, let's go back and see. And I think a lot of times folks who especially are in the eye of the storm, I would say, find it hard to kind of step out of it to see what actually led us here. I hope that makes sense. I hope I'm making sense. But I think that is so important. But I think that's all a part of that first principle I mentioned of braving discomfort, because for us to start working on healing our communities, and repairing harm, it's going to be uncomfortable. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's going to be uncomfortable. And it's us, it's leaders like us, it's nurturing other leaders and growing young leaders to be able to brave that discomfort and walk this out. So that's why I think that principle is so important. Next, I think self-reflection. I think we all have to take the time to do the reflective work. You know, we have to turn that mirror on ourselves and say, how are you showing up in community? You know, why are you going to this community? What is that about? You know, is it selfishly motivated? You know, we have a lot of folks, I see a lot of folks who want to show up just to be seen. And that's not why we do this work. We're not showing up to be seen. Or, you know, when I tell young organizers and activists, I say, if you live by the applause, you'll die by the booze, because people are going to get frustrated. People are not going to always be excited about you being there. So if you're doing it to get the pat on the back, that is not the reason to be in this work. You know, but identifying why am I doing what I do? What baggage am I bringing with me? Looking at yourself truly in a reflective way. You know, people get in their feelings when you mention stuff by prejudice. We all have prejudices. So I like to use a little smoother word. We all have biases. We all bring our biases to the table, no matter what situation we are in. And a bias is only a prejudice in favor or against something, a person, or a group compared to another. We all have unconscious biases, these things that happen automatically when they're triggered in our brains. We make these snap judgments. We all have affinity bias, where we may lean to one group over another. You know, I am a big fan of hip hop. So if the conversation is about hip hop, I'm in there. Let's talk about it. We can talk about it for hours. Now, if somebody decides to start a conversation about, I don't know, heavy metal, I have a lot of information on that. I'm going to probably lean out of that conversation. Not that I have an issue with heavy metal, but not my lane. You know, so I'm going to lean into what I'm familiar with, what I have an affinity to. We just have to make sure that in community, we're not allowing our biases to cause us to make mistakes with people. And that's where that reflective work comes in, you know, making sure that these things I've picked up along the way, because where do our biases come from? Everywhere. It comes from our families. It comes from our friends. It comes from the media. We're taking in so much information, and it's just being filed in our brains. And if we're not careful about how we situate that information or how we evaluate it, it'll cause us to make mistakes with people. And that's what we have to be careful of, being able to examine our biases, look at them fully, identify where those issues or challenges come from, and then be able to properly address it so that we don't make mistakes with people. And we see it happen in society all the time, whether it's Dr. Tamika Cross on a Delta flight, and the flight attendant says, hey, we have a sick patient on the plane. Is there a doctor? And Dr. Tamika Cross, who just so happens to be Black, raises her hand and says, well, I'm a doctor. I don't have my credentials on me, but I'm a doctor. And the flight attendant says, you're not what a doctor looks like. You know, where does that come from? Or a young man who has an iPhone, who's hanging out with his father in New York, you know, who's a musician, and a woman sees him with a cell phone that looks just like hers. You know, that's my phone, only for the Uber driver to come back to return her phone that she left in the ride. Or for John Crawford III to be walking around Walmart shopping, and somebody deciding you should not be in here, and that leads to his death. And those are very opposite from taking a cell phone to, yeah, you're not what a doctor looks like, to costing somebody their lives. And making sure that your biases, again, does not lead us to make mistakes with people or to cause somebody the ultimate harm. So we have to do that work. We have to make sure that our biases don't lead to assumptions. All assumptions do is lead us to use of labels and stereotypes. And the only reason people use labels and stereotypes is because it makes us comfortable. It makes us comfortable. It lets us know who we think you are. And a lot of times we're wrong. So you have to ask yourself, does your biases prevent you from being aware of how societal injustices and conflicts impact those you're in community with? And that may be those you teach, that may be those you worship with, those you work with, or those you just live with. Making sure that your biases don't prevent you from seeing how things in community and society impact others. Again, braving discomfort, because things happen all the time that we're like, I don't get that. I don't understand that. But us doing that self-reflective work lends that empathy, opens that empathy muscle up for us to be able to lean in and understand. And never forget that what you truly believe about others will eventually show up in the way you treat and or talk about others. That's where we have to be careful. It's almost like when you have an argument with somebody and then somebody says something and you're like, you said what you meant. You really want to get that off your chest. You've been holding that. We have to be careful that how we really feel about folks does not come. Careful in making sure that we do the work to make sure that the things that we're saying about folks or how we talk about people is not harmful. And that takes that reflective work. And so I'm gonna show you a quick video. Let me pull it up, make sure I got it here. That deals with blind spots.
Are you seriously considering her as a candidate?
Don't trust her.
She's a woman.
She's a woman.
This is a man's
She's
job.
clearly not educated.
Really? Does she even speak English?
That's not me. I'm not like that. You call it an honest mistake. Science calls it a blind spot. Our unconscious mind is a mysterious and powerful thing. It makes 90% of our decisions without us even knowing it. Our brains are overloaded with 11 million pieces of information every second. Yet we can only process about 40 of them. So we're wired to make cognitive shortcuts, using past experiences to make assumptions. And you know what happens when we assume? Our unconscious mind can put us on autopilot, determining where we sit, who we eat lunch with, who we turn to for advice, and who we choose to offer a helping hand. Living our lives with blind spots can put us in a tunnel. Same point of view, same decisions, same outcomes. We can find ourselves trapped in the land of snap judgments and misconceptions. We've all been on both the giving and receiving end of blind spots. Think about it. Who's talented? Who's able? Who can I trust? Who belongs? We've all been there. Blind spots are part of the human condition. Our choices have consequences for us and the people we interact with. By accepting that blind spots exist, we can stop. Imagine what possibilities exist if we could do it all over again. Different perspectives, inclusive relationships, diverse networks, better outcomes, seeing people for who they really are. People like you, with unlimited potential. We all have blind spots. Once you accept that you have them, you can choose to do something about it. It's time to check your blind spots and focus on what's possible.
And so blind spots, we all have them. And I think my favorite line that he says in that video is that our choices have consequences. And sometimes extremely heavy consequences, which is why I think it's so important that we do that self-reflective work. And it's not a one-time thing. It's not okay, I took the weekend and I reflected and I've gone through all my past trauma and I've done all that and now I've moved forward. And it's constant, it's ongoing. Even myself, I'm constantly reflecting, I'm constantly learning. Even when I connect with new communities, there's something always new to learn. So making sure that we are creating opportunities for inclusive relationships, but that starts with us. It really starts with us. And so I'm gonna take a quick pause and just do a check-in. Any thoughts that have popped up so far?
T. Marie, I've got one,
Yes.
and this is a thought. There's not so much of a question because you've provided the answer, but it's a self-criticism as well. one of the pitfalls I find myself stepping into daily, and it's around our national public square dialogue about any number of topics. And I'm not going to take a position, or I'll just keep it very generic here. But I've got strong opinions, and I react very strongly to people that are coming from another place, let's just say. And I can find myself really writing them off. What a moron. If you think that, then you are either stupid, mentally ill, or evil. I mean, I've said these words, and they're, of course, they're not right, and they are my bias, and they are really othering that person. And I still disagree with them, but that's I've got to find a way to do that without exclusion. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to know kind of how we deal with conflict. I jokingly always tell folks, I'm an INTJ, my Enneagram number is 8. I'm a Scorpio. So this could go several different ways, but I've gotten to the point where it's like, I know my pressure points. So I know on certain topics that I'm extremely passionate about, it's like, okay, if I know we're talking about this is how I need to navigate this conversation, but no, I appreciate you sharing that. It is important because there's things that are so dear to us. And sometimes because we may have been impacted, how I view healthcare may be different from some of my peers, but that's because I've had serious health challenges over the years. So I'm like, no, I should be able to access healthcare like I need it, that is proper and get the best treatment, and somebody, well, I don't think you need all of XYZ. Well, you must not have been sick, so I could easily go 0 to 100 in that conversation. But then it's like, okay, well, let me take a step back. Where's the gap? Where's the, where are we missing each other on this topic? And then also realizing there's some people you're not going to win over. And that's okay as well, but then there are folks that you probably will. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else, anything else has popped up so far? Yes, go ahead.
Sure. Hi. Something that popped up when you mentioned about like the coworker still, the coworker wanting to take your stapler, and something I heard earlier in the week that stuck with me was, something might work, but does it help? And having rules versus resolution, and wondering if you ever encounter having to kind of instruct people to be self-reflective to know what the difference is in coming up with something along those lines.
Yeah, I love that. Something might work, but does it help? That's powerful. The organization I've been working with recently is it's an urban farm, and we're working with young people around agriculture, career opportunities. And we have a group at the office that is our equity committee. And I sit on the equity committee to kind of be more so kind of eyes and ears to make sure, they stay focused. But a group of young staff members who were looking for issues around, they were trying to find white supremacy in certain things. And I said, okay, in effort to create this equitable space, are you creating something just because you want something to respond to, or is that actually an issue here? And we had to sit with that for a while for them to finally kind of take the time to reflect. And it's like, oh, actually, this is not an issue with us, but I just feel like everybody should know about white supremacy. And it's like, that's fine. I have no problem with educating people, but let's not create a problem that doesn't exist because you want to change something. So I think I've seen that with some organizations. I've seen organizations kind of also try to give a Band-Aid response or a knee-jerk response to what everybody was doing the past 2 years is DEI work. We had everything that happened with, I would say, post George Floyd. We got to have DEI. We need a workshop. Let's get somebody in here to talk about XYZ. And it's like, okay, is your goal to truly address the lack of equity in your organization, or do you want to pacify the people of color in your organization to just make them feel like, well, see, we talked about it, we're good, And so I think people have to be very careful to make sure that we're not creating something, but if we're going to respond to things that happen in society, we're being intentional. But I also think it involves involving the people that it's for. I don't like working with groups that it's like, this is just mandatory and everybody has to listen. Okay, but have you explained why you're instituting this new training or these conversations? So yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's definitely important for people to be a part of the conversation. I'm like that no matter what the topic is. I think if you're talking about shifting the culture in your organization, those folks in the organization should be a part of that conversation and making sure we're all starting from the same starting point, but also understanding the same language, the same, because how one group may define a word, how somebody else may define it may be totally different. So making sure people have that understanding, but that people are a part of the process. Yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah, T. Marie, you might define DEI. There may be others who are not
Yes.
familiar, and my friend Lily is here from Germany also. So if we can maybe,
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I saw 2020, I think I did 86 virtual conversations with organizations who wanted some type of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. And in 2021, after January 6th, I had even more invitations. And I said, okay, what we're not going to do this year is just do a blanket kind of one size fit all. We're going to have to do a true deeper dive. So I was more focused with organizations around, if we're going to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we also have to talk about accessibility. We also have to make sure are we creating accessible space, accessible culture? So yeah. Cool. So the next thing, I'm going to show you this slide, and I'm not going to ask you to answer out loud unless you just want to. But there's an exercise I do with folks. There we go. There's an exercise I do with folks when we talk about identity. And so you can either write this down yourself. If you're bold to share it out, you can, but don't feel any pressure. I ask folks, if you look at these identities, and this is just for the purpose of the exercise, there's multiple identities, but I want you to take a good look at these and pick the one that you identify with the most. The one that you identify with the most. Race, religion, and that could be also faith or spirituality, age, disability, gender, class, education, citizenship status, sexuality, or occupation. The one you identify with the most.
Age.
Age, okay. Why age?
Because I feel it every damn minute of every damn day. It's become, it's gone from something I never thought about when I was younger, even 10 years ago, to it's in my face. It's in my face all the time now, And
Gotcha.
yeah. And and not to take up too much time, but that's sort of putting it in the negative. But I really have to say, I mean, I it's funny that I love this, that one jumped right out. There's a positive aspect of this too.
Yeah.
But I'm really, I'm about to I'm in my 70th year. I never thought I'd make it here. I was one of those guys that thought, if I make it past 30, I'm going to be lucky. Um, I'm really appreciating being where I'm at now. And there's aspects of it that are hard fought, hard won, and I wouldn't give them up for anything. Um,
Yeah.
and they hurt.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else?
Hi T, Marie. I fell on race
Okay.
because there's a lot of mixture in my race.
Okay.
African American, Native American, European, some Asian. So, and
Good deal.
that makes it difficult at times to navigate in certain settings.
Mm, gotcha. All right. So I want you to look at these again, look at them hard, and I want you to pick the identity that you identify with the least. The identity that you identify with the least. And I'm not even going to ask you to share, but I'm going to give you an example. So I did this exercise with some educators. There's about 45 of them in a room. And normally when I do this in person, they're posted up on the wall. So I have everybody get up and kind of move around the room. And so I said to them what I just said to you, pick the one that you identify with the least. And everybody, ran to the post of the one that they identify with the least. And I watched this one individual take their time and walk over to disability. Now, there's nothing special about that. But what was interesting was how everybody in the room watched this person, kind of gave this person the side eye, like, why are they walking over there? And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to save that person for last. So we went around the room, everybody shared, and I got back to that individual and I said, why did you pick disability? And this person said, well, I don't have a disability. Nobody in my family has a disability. I don't think about it. So it's not a part of my life. Nothing is wrong with that answer. I said, understood. Thank you for sharing. I said, but let me ask you something. I said, what do you do in education? And this person said, well, I'm a special education counselor. And I said, okay. I said, well, let me ask you another thing. Is it possible to truly advocate for someone you cannot see? Then she told me she did not like me anymore and she didn't like my workshop. And I was like, that's okay. Again, I don't do it for the applause, And so, but later she reached back out months later and said that she really took some time to reflect on that. But this piece of the exercise is about who don't we see? Who are we missing in community? Some of us, we don't have to think about citizenship status. That's not in question for us. But there are a lot of people in our community, in our society, that is a serious concern. Some of us don't think about gender. Never crosses our mind because of how we walk through society. It's not an issue. And so thinking about who are we missing? Who am I missing in community that I may not see? And then the last one, choose the identity from this list that you have the most social power. The most social power. And when we start thinking about social power and how we share power, it's about leveraging our relationships, our network, our resources to support and help other communities. I come from a family of ministers, PK kid, preacher's kid. And so for me, a lot of times, one of the biggest issues or challenges we have in the activist and organizing community is finding space to have something, whether it's to host a meeting, whether it's to do an event. Finding space is the most frustrating aspect of doing this work sometimes. And so a lot of times I lean in on the fact that, hey, I know a lot of ministers. And what do ministers have? They got churches, they got spaces, So I'll lean in on that part of my identity and say, hey, remember me? I'm so-and-so's daughter, so-and-so's granddaughter. I'm trying to do this thing for the community. Could we use your multipurpose center? Can we use the sanctuary for this conversation? And so I'll use that and leverage that to get into certain spaces. Sometimes the fact that I'm Black helps in some conversations that I want to be a part of. It's like, oh, well, you don't have representation. You need somebody that can speak to that community. Sometimes I utilize education on certain things. I'm not a big fan of, oh, I got these degrees and this is what I have, but in some circles, it works. It gets you in the door. And so this whole exercise was thinking about how you show up in community, how you're seen, how you see yourself, also who you're missing or who we might be missing in community, but also in the ways that we can share power and open up space and bring other people to the table. How do we use our identity to leverage that? That makes sense. Hope that makes sense. Good deal. Good deal. And so next, come out of that for a little bit. I want to talk about deep listening. I think taking the time to truly listen to folks is so key and so important. And it makes people feel valued. It makes them feel heard. It makes them feel a part of the conversation, a part of the change, the shifting, whatever may be going on. I think a lot of times, we get accustomed to listening to respond, or we're already coming in with our own agenda that we're ready to share. So actually taking the time to truly listen to people, and I think that incorporates allowing people to complete their story. We don't want to try to cut people off. We don't want to assume we know what their story is. Allowing people to share their full story. Sometimes that requires us repeating it back to make sure we understood, clarifying. So when you said this, that's exactly what okay, gotcha. I just wanted to make sure I understood, but also validating that their story is true. A lot of times because we haven't experienced, we don't experience every single thing, and we may have similar experiences, but we have our own path. Allowing people to have their truth. Just because you're not experiencing it doesn't mean that somebody else is not. I worked with an organization last year where this guy, older white gentleman, and this Black lady, probably in her 40s, they had sons around the same age. And, the guy was like, my son is getting ready to drive, and, he's so excited about getting a car. So, we're going out looking for cars. And she's like, oh, we are not there yet. I'm not ready to have that conversation. My son already knows we're not doing that yet. And he's like, what are you talking about? They're young, they're 16. It's the time they get a car. Like, no, you got to make sure your son gets a car. She's like, nope, I'm not ready. I'm too afraid. He's like, well, what are you scared of? And she's like, where have you been? And finally, she was like, no, I'm too scared to let my child drive around in a car and know that his skin complexion could cause him not to return home. And this guy who she's been working with for years was like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And she's like, are you understanding what's happening in society? And he literally had a moment of, I never considered that. He's not having that talk with his son, that 10 and 2 conversation. He's like, what? They're young. They're okay. What? He gets a ticket. And she's like, no, I want my child to return home. And so them having to have that dialogue, coming from 2 totally different places and experiences of, hey, we may be cool. We work together. We got kids the same age, but how your son is walking through the world and how my son is walking through the world is totally different. And him being able to kind of take a step back and like, wow, I didn't realize that. But that took him having to slow down and listen, not convince her, oh, it'll be all right. They're young. No, to truly understand what is the root of that fear. And it's not just mom being overprotective. Like, no, we are dealing with societal issues And we have seen how this has played out numerous times before. I'm scared to send my baby out there. And that takes that time to truly listen. And listening is an action. It takes action on our part. It also takes restraint to not be so ready to jump in and say something sometimes. Because you know how we do? We want to talk, we want to dialogue. And sometimes it's like, no, let this other person share. And I always tell people, silence is golden, not just at the movies, but it's also golden in life. You know, you don't always have to fill space with words. Sometimes something is shared and we just need to honor that that was shared. And that's something that somebody is either dealing with, carrying, or that we need to sit with. It's not always a response for it. I think it's also important to understand the role of empathy when it comes to deep listening. You know, having the capacity to understand what somebody is experiencing or going through from their frame of reference. You know, a lot of times you'll hear people say, you know, if I were you, I would. And it's like, well, you're not coming from that person's frame of reference. They may not even have access to the knowledge you have to even make a different decision, or access to the resources to do something different. How does somebody pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they don't have boots? So having and exercising and growing that empathy muscle. And then I think also trust is a part of listening. You know, I think a lot of times we do community work or we want to do things that are helpful and we feel like, well, I'm a trustworthy person. I'm a good person. They should trust me. Well, why? They don't know you. That has to build, that has to grow, that takes time. We have to nurture that. One of the things I tell organizations that get grants and, oh, we're going to go into this community and do X, Y, Z. First thing I say is write into your grant time for trust building. Build the relationships with these folks. A lot of times people want, oh, I got the money, let's go in and do. And then they feel like, well, the community doesn't want us. They don't care about this. They don't need this. And it's like, that may not necessarily be true. They didn't send for you. Or they didn't ask, or they may have something that's more important that they want to address than the issue you're bringing. I worked with a community where the folks were like, this big organization came in and they said, we're going to bring you all this and this and this and this. And the community said, we want a grocery store. Okay, we hear you, but we got these art programs for kids. And then we're going to bring this in. And they was like, oh, okay, but we need a grocery store in our community. And after about 4 or 5 years, I remember somebody's like, well, T. Marie, we don't understand why these folks have such a high rate of juvenile diabetes in the community. Like, do these parents just not care about what they feed their children? I was like, they care. I said, but they want a grocery store and they can't get people to work with them to get a grocery store. But you know what they do have? Have a beautiful golden arches. They have all the unhealthy stuff. And now you think mom or dad or grandma or whoever doesn't care because they're subject to what's available. In a community that has very fractured transit. So the closest grocery store is in a community over. And if you're dependent on public transit, I don't know if you've ever carried groceries on a bus, but it is not, it's not a good time. It is not a fun trip. And so getting folks to understand that trust takes time and you have to meet people where they are. And again, it might be uncomfortable. They might shoot your idea down, you know, and they may say, just not now. It's not that we don't need what you're bringing or don't want it. This is kind of top priority. So taking the time to build that relationship, build that trust within communities, listening to them, empathizing with them in order to be of service in the community. And then lastly, proximity and action. You know, what does that mean? Getting proximate, getting close. What does that look like? I think it's also important to when you're getting close to communities, to find out and do your research on who was there before you. I think a lot of times we go into communities and we have these great ideas and we are met with resistance, and it's not necessarily always us or with the new idea. Could they have been harmed before? And I think that's vital information for whatever you're trying to do with a new community. Who was here before? Did somebody else try to do something similar? What happened? Did they run out ahead of the community? I think it's important. I call them staples in the community. Who are those staples in the community? That could be that coach that's been coaching the middle school football team or the summer football league for 30, 40 years. They know everybody's business. They know everything. That may be Miss Johnson, who's been living in the community for years, or is the neighborhood president. That could be a local pastor who people trust and they talk to. Finding those folks who can give you that information, but who can also leverage their relationship in the community to bring you in to have those larger conversations. So as we get proximate, as we get close to these communities, making sure we find out who was there before us, if anything, any harm was done that we need to be aware of, so that as we're coming in the right way. I think it's also important to remember that, people are not looking for heroes. Leave that to the movies. And I love movies. I'm a big Marvel fan, love them, but that's where we leave the heroes. Let's not put on our invisible capes and run out to communities and we're here to save the day. No, people want to be a part of their own change. People want to do things for themselves as well, and when you come in as a hero, you come in assuming, and we want to make sure we don't assume. Because if you really pay any close attention to hero films, heroes actually leave a lot of destruction in their saving of people. No matter who the hero is, we're gonna save the world, but now we got to figure out how to rebuild what you've torn up that you were saving us from. So making sure we're not going in with the attitude of assuming or trying to save people. And if you think you're the answer to people's problems, you might want to rethink that. We want to make sure that we're including people in change, in shift, in community conversations about things that impact them. I believe that those who are closest to the problem are the closest to the solution. They know what they need for their situation to change. It's not always this big thing out in the sky. A lot of times it's something extremely simple. If this barrier was removed, I could actually do X, Y, and Z. So getting close to those folks, making sure they're part of the conversations, making sure, we're creating equity by, lending space, whether it's letting somebody be a part of a conversation, letting them have your seat at the table, or saying, you know what, in order for us to do this effectively, I'm advocating for these folks to be involved. They need to share in on this. I think when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, I think it's important to understand, all of that, if we're not careful, becomes a box check. Diversity is about full representation. Are we who we say we are, and are we showing up that way? In true diverse communities, people are given space to show up authentically, and value is placed on them being there. It's not about us being comfortable, again, about who people are. It's allowing people to fully show up as they are, and us valuing that in their voice. Diversity is about being invited in, and should be more than an invitation. It has to be a commitment. In our work, if we're saying we're diverse, if we're saying we respect other voices, we got to commit to that. A lot of times, I think that's what's missing when we throw out DEI. I think the A is missing when it comes to accessibility, but I think the biggest thing that's missing is that C, and that's the commitment. Because it sounds cute, it looks fun. It's like, yo, we're DEI, but no, are we actually committed to making sure we're valuing all of the voices that need to be brought to the table. You know, inclusion is also more than a box check. And we don't want to be performative when it comes to inclusion. You know, inclusion, again, is about commitment to move out of the way to allow people to truly participate in the community. It's not about saying, oh, we're going to do this with this community and we're letting them participate in name. No, bring them in, let them lead parts of it. Let them make decisions. Let them make suggestions. With the work that I'm doing on the farm, I'm revamping this whole workforce program, and all of these young apprentices that are between the ages of 18 and 23 have been a part of the think tank. You know, I'm like, hey, I'm not a teenager. I'm not even working on the farm. How would this be better for you? What barriers do you run into daily to get here that I can work on eliminating or at least addressing? You know, because it's easy for me. I jump up in the morning, I hop in my Camry, I go to work. But I got young people that they're dependent on either public transportation or somebody bringing them to work. One person said, well, you know what, T. Marie, it would help if y'all just had a van. And if y'all had pickup locations, you know, we could just meet to the pickup location and come to work. And I said, good point. Transportation should not prevent you from being a part of this program. So then I go back to my boss and I say, we need a van. I need you to find some money to get a van so we can have pickup locations. But it also opens it up for us to touch more students. So now if I have a spot that I can say, hey, if y'all are at the corner of such and such, every morning, a van will pick you up and bring you to work. Now I'm creating an entry point for these young people. But if they weren't a part of that conversation, and this program has been going on for years, nobody had thought about a van before, but they was like, I want to come to work, but could you help me get there? Until I get to a place where I can handle my own transportation. You know, so it's that commitment to allowing people to participate. And then lastly, equity. Equity is action oriented, and it has to start top down. I believe everything rises and falls with leadership. John Maxwell says that all the time. Equity is about the proper treatment and the elimination of disparities, providing everybody in the community with ownership, agency, and control. It means us working towards outcomes in ways that model dignity, that model justice, that model love. And I think that's where we have to get back to. I really feel like us getting back to that place of truly loving our neighbor. And if we really follow that scripture all the way out, as we love ourselves, and if we really love ourselves that much, can we do that work and make sure that we're extending that same love and compassion and empathy to our neighbors? And so again, I think it's important for us to understand we're going to have to brave discomfort. It's not going to be fun. It's going to make us feel funny. Sometimes it's going to stretch us to go outside of ourselves. It's going to stretch us to expand our knowledge. It's going to stretch us sometimes to expand our relationships. You know, who's missing from your circle? You know, if you look, does everybody in your circle think, believe, and look like you? And if they do, you might want to expand. You might want to bring in some different folks. I went through that for a time and I realized I was on a panel with a Jewish guy and I was like, I don't have any Jewish friends. Why don't I have any Jewish friends? And I was like, ding, ding, you're going to be number one. Let's go hang out. Let's get to know each other. And since then, I have been able to grow my relationships within the Jewish community and can say I actually have friends that just so happen to be Jewish. You know, so how do we do that? We got to brave that discomfort. We got to get places where we're not always comfortable. We got to do the self-reflective work. We got to take the time to look at us ourselves and say, hey, what is that? What baggage are you bringing? What blind spots do you have? Do you have biases that may cause you to make mistakes with people? Let's deal with that. Let me address that. Taking the time to listen deeply to folks, building that empathy muscle, taking time for trust to grow and relationships to grow, and then getting proximate to the people who you want to help, you want to support, you want to serve, you want to stand in allyship with, but don't stop there. Commit to action. And so that is my presentation, but I'll pause to see if anybody had any thoughts or reflections they wanted to share.
Feel free. We're a small enough group. You can just go ahead and unmute if you have a comment.
T. Marie, well, first of all, thank you for your presentation this morning. I really found it helpful. I'm interested in hearing your experiences and advice in dealing with communities that speak a different language as a first language. You know, I was intently listening to your deep listening section, and I, you know, reflecting on experiences that I have dealing with communities that don't speak English, and it's hard and it gets uncomfortable very quickly, and I tend to back off.
Oh, understandable.
Yeah, so I'm just curious to hear your experiences working with the communities that don't share your language.
Yeah, so I was actually working with the Birmingham Police Department a few years ago, where this was kind of pre-conversations around sanctuary cities. But Birmingham at the time, about 217,000 residents, 27,000 Hispanic residents in the Metro Birmingham area. And as I was working with the police department, we found out that we didn't have any bilingual officers. And I was like, that's crazy. How does that happen when you have this many Hispanic residents in a community? And so a friend of mine who is Hispanic, I was holding these listening sessions with who was the new police chief at the time. And she was like, T. Marie, the police never come and talk to us. They don't even want to, you know, attempt or try. And so the new police chief was like, well, T. Marie, let's set it up. So we go and meet with some Hispanic residents, and not all of them could speak English, but they showed up. And it was a very uncomfortable for the police department first meeting, because they were using language that was harmful, but language they had become accustomed to in society. So they would say, you know, well, what we're doing with illegal aliens, and then I would have to stop it. I was like, we don't say illegal aliens. We say undocumented residents, you know, and then I asked the Hispanic community, hey, is there another term you would like us to use? And so it was a very tense meeting that probably was an hour and a half that probably felt like 5 years for the police department. But every time, the role I held in that space was trying to hold the room in the sense of, okay, that's harmful. We're not going to say that. We're going to use this terminology. This is the agreed upon terminology. And we ended up going back for 4 additional kind of sit down sessions that led to that organization, the Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama. It led to them actually going to the police department and doing informational classes on how, why Hispanic residents have challenges with law enforcement, but giving them more of a history lesson of the things that they have dealt with in their countries when it comes to law enforcement. So now the police were able to get more context on, no, I'm not necessarily don't like law enforcement. It's that these are the experiences that I've had with law enforcement that brought me to this country. They also were able to work with them on translating some of their information on their website. Also saying, hey, y'all need to probably hire Hispanic folks to actually be, you know, dispatchers, to work in conjunction with the police, especially around domestic violence situations. And they also translated their information cards that police had in their cards. So what started out as a very tense initial meeting, because everybody committed to showing back up, we were able to make some strides. And then they also asked the police department to offer incentives for police officers to learn Spanish and Portuguese. And so but being able to bring those folks to the table opened up all these other ideas of how do we bridge this divide? Well, you don't have anybody that speaks Spanish? We speak Spanish. we could come and help, we can translate, we can do this. So I wouldn't say the relationship is perfect or where it probably needs to be, but it's so much more advanced now. And there's that working relationship now. I hope that helped.
Yeah. Is it okay if I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So really interesting to hear, but the onus then was on the Hispanic community to come and educate the Birmingham police on their experience living in Birmingham from what I'm gathering. One of the things that,
And I will say it wasn't necessarily on them. They actually offered. They actually offered. So it wasn't a thing of where, and I'm sensitive to that as well, but they were like, no, I think it was more so because around this time we were having challenges with ICE in our community. And so they saw it as we can be proactive as a community in protecting our folks if we help you understand why the things you're doing is harmful. So these were more advocates who stepped up and said, we'll come in and teach the classes. They didn't want to put that on, your everyday resident to do, but the advocates who were actually doing the work were like, no, we'll come in and share.
Yeah. So in that case, they were willing to come forward and help provide that background information. I guess I'm thinking, reflecting on my own work, I deal with, and what you were saying about learning how we got to this point, right? Before we take action or talk about issues.
Yeah.
How appropriate is it for me to ask the people that I'm dealing with to tell me where they came from? Like, I don't want to be a burden. I don't want them to continue to talk about the difficulties and the barriers, but in many cases, I don't know what to do. There are certain communities that I deal with, like, the history is easy to find and I should be able to do that work, but there are some other communities that I work with that it's like, if I don't ask them, I don't know. I don't know how we got to this point.
No,
right?
no, I totally hear you. And I think that's why it's so important to identify those relationships. I think those staples are so key because you'll have people, I always liken it to this with folks. I'm like, ask me whatever you want to ask. Don't ask LaShawn, who sits 2 cubicles down from you, to explain it all. I think you have people in communities who are already invested in doing that work, that is identifying those folks to say, hey, I'm trying to learn more. I would like to be a support. I would like to be an ally. Can we sit down and talk sometime? I just want to make sure I'm entering the community right, or if I even need to be. And those people are out there. Now, the person who's just living life, who I'm just trying to do me and make a way for my family, I would say they're not the folks to kind of lean in on. But when you have, like, I think whether it's as neighborhood associations or you have organizations who have advocates on the ground, I think leaning into those folks first and getting, hey, I'm trying to understand, do you have additional resources? Can we sit down and talk? I think they'll be open to it. I think it's more so people get frustrated when people come with their own ideas and initiatives already. And it's like, oh, we're going to come do this in your community. And it's like, whoa, we got our own things we're working on. So I think, like, finding those folks in your community who are already doing that work and having those conversations. I have yet to see a group be adversary to that when you're truly trying to learn. I was working with some folks. We have some people here in Birmingham where we have a large Nigerian population kind of on the outskirts of Birmingham. And I got brought in, my cousin was actually working at this hospital because they were having issues where the nurses were offended with the cultural practices of this community. And so I came in to do kind of a cultural humility training with them and getting them to understand, okay, I'm all for girl power, but if this community culturally, this is how they make decisions, that is okay. And you don't necessarily have to understand that. You can please respect it, and so we had to have that kind of dialogue of, people may have different cultural practices. than you, and that is okay. But I think definitely reaching out to folks who may be in that community, a part of that community, are already working with that community to get additional information. I don't see why they would be adversary to it. And it takes time. That's the discomfort, is that it takes time, and a lot of times relationships only move at the speed of trust, so if we don't have that trust with communities, we have to build it. And that takes time. And sometimes that, slows down maybe what we want to do personally. But I promise you, you'll be the better for it if you take the time to build. I hope that was helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. Any other thoughts or questions?
And I'll certainly put this in the category of this is just my opinion, of course. But I think, especially around the language question, there's really an obvious answer here. It seems to me, and that is, as U.S. Americans, we notoriously do not learn other languages. And I've had the pleasure of working in Asia and in Europe, and it's just typical. Again, my friend Lily's on the call, and she's Lily's a German speaker, but speaks excellent English and probably speaks another language or two, and that's really common elsewhere in the world. All the work I did in Asia, people spoke 2, 3, 4 languages really well enough to connect, and I don't want to have this sound like a finger wagging thing. I realize it sure could really easily. And I'd wag my finger at myself first because I'm a dabbler in languages. But, especially where I live in the Southwest, I really feel like it's our obligation to be bilingual. We should speak Spanish. And if we really want to be welcoming with our neighbors. And it's such a, when we make that effort, even if it's poorly executed, and I'm good at that. I think people feel it. I think they, hey, this guy's trying to connect, and it may be a little clumsy, but I feel it. So yeah.
No, I agree. I did some work with our literacy council here some years ago and found out we have in the state, I think at the time it was like 100 other languages that was being spoken. And I was just like, wow. I was like, we're slipping. We need to catch up. But I completely agree. I definitely agree with you. We definitely should do more of that. And I think another thing that I do a lot too with that's also helpful, Marlon, I think with having some of these harder conversations with different groups is I do community agreements. Especially when I'm moderating community conversations, where I let everybody kind of identify how we're going to guide the conversation, and it may be, we're going to respect everybody's experience. We're going to maintain confidentiality. Just because you've heard this story here, this is somebody's personal life story. Don't go out and use that as, whatever. And then I ask community members to add to the list. So if the conversation kind of veers off or gets a little crazy, we can say, hey, Kate, let's kind of remember what our community agreements were. And so I've seen that help in community conversations when you don't know who's coming to participate. It kind of helps, keeps everybody centered on what the task is. So that's something I've just used sometimes with conversations.
Folks, we have a few more minutes. If anybody has a thought or something to share or a question or another idea to throw in.
I have another question, but I don't want to be the white guy taking up all the space.
Go for it.
Go ahead.
You can make your best efforts to try to understand the community that you're working with and be sincere about your involvement, but there will be times when you step in it, right? That you've inadvertently done something wrong that is offensive or really damages your relationships. I'm curious to hear your experience in those kinds of situations and what you've done to repair the damage that you did.
I feel good to say I haven't done a lot of damage. I am a lot of times in communal space, I'm very slow to respond. I will take the time to let me marinate on that for a moment, especially if it's something that's very controversial. I do my best to try to do as much research as possible, especially when I'm stepping out in certain conversations. You know, we've had conversations here about Confederate monuments, and T. Marie, what do you think? And it's like, let me prepare something and I'll get back to you. So I try to be very intentional with my words, but I know I've said things sometimes that may have been controversial, not intending to harm. I'm sure people have gotten harmed. But I always try to be the person I try to maintain an openness of, this is the vantage point I'm coming from. This is why I feel this way about this. And I'm willing to sit down and discuss it further with you so you understand why I'm coming from this vantage point. I don't speak on every panel. I don't just show up at everything so I'm very intentional in what I participate in. And I think that's kind of insulated me in some ways, because my concern is not about being seen or being a part of the conversation to say I'm a part of the conversation, but I'd rather be in the background pushing people to, no, I need you to read this. I need you to understand this. I'm the one that will show up at the city council meeting. And even though, I'm cool with most of the people who are in those positions of power, I have no problem saying this is harming this community over here. And I'm here to speak on that. So yeah, I just try to be intentional on what I pick. And I think because of that, I've gained the reputation of, if I show up to a conversation, it's a reason why I'm there. It's not just to, shake the bells and blow the whistles. It's, oh, if T. Marie is here, like I put it this, we had an issue in the city and I showed up to the city council meeting and the mayor walked down to where I was sitting and he was like, what are you upset about? And I was like, I can't just come and participate in my civic duty. And he was like, no, he said, you do a lot. And if you're here, you're mad about something that's on the agenda. And I was like, maybe, and I was there for a specific issue that I had a problem with that was impacting one of the communities. And I wanted to stand in allyship with that community because I thought what they were doing was wrong. So for me, I feel like if you harm somebody, I think it's being honest about, that's not my intent to harm. This is kind of where I am on it. I would love to sit down with you so you understand, but also having that invitation of, and I would love to hear where you're coming from, because there may be a side of it that I'm not seeing, because we don't know it all. We don't know how it's all impacting other people. We're going to harm folks. Hopefully it's not intentional, but if we do, just creating that space to repair, I think is always necessary. Because I think sometimes if we go trying not to step in the poop, we still end up stepping in the poop, but I think when you show up properly, when you're showing up and people know you're trying to be as less harmful as possible, I think people will give you that space for grace. And I think the more grace we extend to people, the more grace we get back. I wish it was much easier than that, but I haven't figured that piece out yet. I'll keep you posted.
Thanks for that. And thanks for your question, Marlon. That is really a good one.
And I think so I have a suggestion. And it's a youth focused book, but it's such a good read. There's this book called Ghost Boys. And I kind of slid into this this educators like group last year that was supposed to be for Minneapolis educators. I didn't realize that. I just responded to what I saw on social media and showed up. But I read this book Ghost Boys, and it is phenomenal. It's for middle school and up. It has discussion questions in it. And what's so powerful about this book is it's about this young man who is killed, young Black boy is killed by a white police officer. And he doesn't fully cross over into the afterlife. But he's met by a ghost guide who is Emmett Till. And he joins these other ghost boys that include Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice. But the only person that can see him is the police officer's daughter. And so he lingers on during the trial of his murder. Powerful book, really hits compassion, conflict, all those things we wrestle with in such a powerful way. So I would encourage you to check this out if you're a reader and kind of like exploring different literature. So that's my offer today. But I hope this was helpful. I hope the conversation was meaningful and I shared something that at least got you thinking a little deeper.